The September afternoon sun cast a golden glow across Street Mary Mead's village green, where the annual harvest festival had drawn nearly every resident from their cottages and gardens. Beneath the ancient oak tree, trestle tables groaned under the weight of prize-winning vegetables, homemade preserves, and Mrs. Price's legendary Victoria sponge. The gentle hum of conversation mingled with the distant sound of children's laughter, creating the sort of peaceful tableau that made visitors understand why people chose to live in such places. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a folding chair near the tea tent, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm while her pale blue eyes observed the familiar faces around her. To any casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in her lacework, but those who knew her well understood that Miss Marple was always watching, always listening, always learning something new about human nature. "Such a lovely day for Eleanor's departure," remarked Mrs. Bantry, settling beside her friend with a cup of tea. "Though I must say, the dear girl seemed rather subdued this morning when I saw her at the post office." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. Eleanor Vance, the young governess who had spent the summer at the Cedars with Colonel and Mrs. Ainsworth, was scheduled to catch the 4:15 train from Milchester Station that afternoon. Her temporary position had concluded, and she was returning to London to take up a permanent post with a family in Kensington. Perhaps she was simply feeling melancholy about leaving, Miss Marple suggested gently. Young people often form attachments to places, even when they know their stay is temporary. Across the green, Colonel Ainsworth stood near the flower tent, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. His wife, a rather theatrical woman prone to nervous complaints, was examining the dahlia entries with the sort of intense concentration that suggested her mind was elsewhere entirely. Miss Marple noted how the Colonel kept glancing toward the lane that led to the main road, as if expecting someone. Eleanor planned to walk to the station, Mrs. Bantry continued, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Such a pleasant afternoon for a stroll," and she said she wanted to say a proper goodbye to the countryside. Her luggage went ahead with Plumley's carrier this morning. The festival continued its gentle rhythm around them. Dr. Haydock judged the vegetable marrows with scientific precision, while the vicar's wife supervised the children's games with maternal efficiency. P.C. Troughton, the local constable, sampled Mrs. Dolly's jam tarts with the sort of thorough attention he brought to all his duties, however minor they might be. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the first whisper of concern began to circulate. Mrs. Higgins, whose husband managed the ticket office at Milchester Station, had arrived with news that made several conversations pause mid-sentence. Eleanor never appeared for the 4:15, she announced to the small group gathered around the cake stall. My herald waited until the very last moment, thinking she might have been delayed, but there was no sign of her. The news rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Colonel Ainsworth strode over, his face creased with worry. "That's impossible," he declared. "Eleanor left the Cedars at 3:30 precisely. I saw her myself, walking toward the main road with her small handbag." Mrs. Ainsworth, who had been examining prize roses with exaggerated interest, now hurried to join them, her face pale. "But she must have caught the train. Where else could she be?" Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her mind already beginning to work through the possibilities. A young woman didn't simply vanish on a country lane in broad daylight, not without reason. As the concerned voices grew louder around her, she found herself remembering Eleanor's subdued manner that morning, and wondering what secrets might lie beneath the surface of their peaceful village life. The news rippled through the remaining festival-goers like a stone dropped into still water, each circle of whispered conversation growing wider and more agitated. The cheerful atmosphere dissolved as quickly as sugar in rain, replaced by the particular blend of concern and excitement that accompanies unexpected drama in small communities. P.C. Troughton, his uniform suddenly feeling more official than it had while sampling jam tarts, cleared his throat with newfound authority. "Right then, we'll need to organize a proper search. Miss Vance might have taken ill along the way, or perhaps lost her bearings on one of the footpaths. Colonel Ainsworth stepped forward immediately, his military bearing asserting itself. "Quite right, Constable. I'll gather some of the younger men to check the direct route to Milchester." Eleanor left the Cedars at 3:30 precisely. I watched her walk toward the main road myself. She seemed perfectly composed. "Mrs." Ainsworth added, though her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there earlier. Perhaps a touch quieter than usual at breakfast, but Eleanor was always rather reserved. She did receive a letter with the Morning Post from London, I believe, but she tucked it away without comment. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. "A letter from London, you say? How interesting. Did she seem troubled by its contents?" "I couldn't say, Mrs." Ainsworth replied, wringing her handkerchief. She read it quickly and put it straight into her handbag. I assumed it concerned her new position. Dr. Haydock, abandoning his judging duties at the vegetable tent, joined the growing circle. Eleanor struck me as remarkably sensible, not the sort to abandon her commitments without explanation. He glanced meaningfully at the colonel. "You're certain she appeared well when she left?" "Perfectly well," the colonel insisted, though Miss Marple noticed how his jaw tightened slightly. "She thanked us for our hospitality, collected her handbag, and set off at her usual brisk pace." As the search parties organized themselves, Miss Marple remained quietly observant. She watched Mrs. Ainsworth choose to stay at the festival rather than join the search, noting how the woman's eyes kept darting toward the lane where Eleanor had last been seen. The colonel's insistence on Eleanor's punctuality seemed almost defensive, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as others. "Perhaps she changed her mind about the position," suggested Mrs. Price hopefully. "Young people can be quite impulsive." "Nonsense," declared Mrs. Bantry firmly. "Eleanor was looking forward to her new situation. She mentioned it only yesterday when we met at the post office." Within the hour, the various search parties began returning with disappointing news. The lane to Milchester showed no signs of disturbance, and none of the cottage dwellers along the route had seen a young woman with a handbag that afternoon. Eleanor Vance had seemingly vanished between the Cedars and the main road, leaving no trace of her passage. Miss Marple listened to each report with quiet attention, her pale blue eyes moving from face to face as the villagers shared their findings. "How curious," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry. "A young woman doesn't simply disappear on a country lane in broad daylight, especially one carrying important correspondence." "You think that letter might be significant?" Dr. Haydock asked, overhearing. "In my experience, Doctor, young women don't usually abandon well-paying positions without compelling reason. A letter from London, received on the very morning of departure, might provide such reason." As the September sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the village green, the festival's remnants took on an almost sinister quality. The abandoned tea tent flapped gently in the evening breeze, and the prize vegetables seemed to watch accusingly from their display tables. P.C. Troughton consulted his pocket watch with growing unease. "We'll need to contact the authorities in Milchester if she doesn't turn up by nightfall. This isn't like anything we've had in Street Mary Mead before." Miss Marple folded her knitting with deliberate precision. The girl who never reached the station had left behind more than just an empty seat on the 4:15 train. She had left a mystery that would require all of Miss Marple's understanding of human nature to unravel. As darkness settled over Street Mary Mead that evening, the search parties returned empty-handed, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies through the lanes. The festival decorations, still hanging from the oak tree, fluttered in the night breeze, with an almost mournful quality that seemed to echo the village's growing unease. Miss Marple spent a restless night, her mind turning over the curious details of Eleanor Vance's disappearance. By morning, the matter had transformed from local concern into official investigation. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham with the early train, his sharp eyes and methodical manner bringing a sobering reality to what some villagers had hoped might resolve itself overnight. Missing persons rarely stay missing without reason, he announced to the small gathering at the Blue Boar, where P.C. Troughton had assembled the key witnesses. Young women don't vanish into country air, particularly not sensible governesses with confirmed employment waiting in London. Miss Marple, positioned near the window with her knitting, observed how the inspector's brisk efficiency seemed to heighten certain tensions. Mrs. Ainsworth's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirts, while Colonel Ainsworth maintained his military bearing with what appeared to be deliberate effort. "We'd like to examine Miss Vance's room, if we may," Inspector Craddock continued, consulting his notebook. "And I'll need detailed statements about her final hours at the Cedars." The examination of Eleanor's room proved more revealing than anyone had anticipated. The small chamber under the eaves remained exactly as she'd left it. Bed made with governess-like precision, books stacked tidily, lavender still fresh in its chipped vase. But it was what remained that caught Miss Marple's attention. Her hat, she observed quietly, noting the blue felt with its narrow grosgrain band hanging on the peg downstairs. "Mrs. Ainsworth, you mentioned Eleanor wore her blue hat when she departed." Mrs. Ainsworth's face went pale. "Why, yes, I'm certain of it. She always wore that hat for traveling." But the hat hung precisely where Miss Marple had first noticed it, undisturbed since the previous day. Inspector Craddock made careful note of this discrepancy, his expression growing more serious. In Eleanor's writing desk, beneath the blotter, Miss Marple discovered a torn corner of thick blue paper bearing a partial hotel letterhead, Cavendish, the sort of expensive stationery not found in village shops. The fragment suggested correspondence from London's more exclusive establishments, hardly the typical communication from an employment agency. "The letter that arrived yesterday morning," Inspector Craddock pressed Mrs. Ainsworth. "You said it was from London regarding her new position?" "I assumed so," Mrs. Ainsworth replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor read it quickly and tucked it into her handbag without comment. The investigation took a dramatic turn when young Tommy Fletcher, the baker's son, approached Inspector Craddock with information that shattered their assumptions about Eleanor's intended route. "I saw Miss Vance yesterday afternoon, sir," Tommy reported earnestly. "She was standing by the old stile near Hangman's Wood, looking back toward the village as if waiting for someone. This would have been near 4 o'clock. I was making Mrs. Clement's delivery, and she's particular about punctuality." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the assembled group. If Eleanor had been at the stile at 4 o'clock, she had not only missed her train but had deliberately travelled in the opposite direction from the station. Colonel Ainsworth's face darkened with confusion. "That's impossible." Eleanor left the Cedars at 3:30, walking directly toward the main road. "I watched her go myself." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. "Perhaps, Colonel, Eleanor had an appointment to keep before catching her train, an appointment that someone else arranged." The implication hung in the air like morning mist. Eleanor Vance had not simply disappeared. She had been diverted from her intended path, either by choice or by circumstance. The question that now faced them was whether this diversion had been Eleanor's decision or whether someone had intercepted her journey for reasons that remained disturbingly unclear. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "We'll need to search Hangman's Wood thoroughly, and I want to know everything about the contents of that letter from London." He paused, his gaze moving from face to face. "Because it's becoming clear that Eleanor Vance's disappearance was neither accidental nor spontaneous." As the morning sun climbed higher over street, Mary Mead, casting sharp shadows across the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. A young woman who left her hat behind, received mysterious correspondence from an expensive London hotel, and kept a secret appointment in the woods. These were not the actions of someone simply traveling to a new position. They were the actions of someone caught in circumstances far more complex and potentially dangerous than anyone had initially suspected. The search of Hangman's Wood began in earnest as the morning sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries of village secrets. Inspector Craddock organized the volunteers into methodical lines, their voices calling Eleanor's name echoing through the twisted branches and tangled undergrowth that gave the wood its mysterious character. Miss Marple accompanied the search party, her sharp eyes noting details that others might dismiss as insignificant. Near the old stile where Tommy Fletcher had spotted Eleanor, she paused beside a patch of disturbed earth where someone had clearly stood for some time. The grass was flattened in two distinct areas, one deeper impression suggesting someone heavier, the other lighter and more delicate. "Inspector," she called quietly, beckoning Craddock over to examine a gold-tipped cigarette end half buried beneath fallen leaves. "This appears to be of rather expensive quality Turkish tobacco, I believe." P.C. Troughton, crouching nearby, held up the evidence with careful fingers. "Egyptian blend, sir. The sort Mr. Pierce smokes. He's been staying at the Blue Boar these past 3 weeks, dealing in antique silver from the larger houses." Miss Marple's keen eyes also spotted something else, a few pale blue threads caught on a hawthorn branch at shoulder height, and nearby, a small fragment of thick paper bearing the partial letterhead Cavendish in embossed script. The same hotel stationery that had arrived in Eleanor's morning post. As they continued their search deeper into the wood, the volunteers' initial enthusiasm began to wane. Hours passed with no sign of Eleanor herself, only these tantalizing clues that suggested she had indeed kept an appointment at the stile before vanishing entirely. The wood seemed to have swallowed her as completely as if she had never existed. By afternoon, frustration and speculation began to replace methodical searching. It was then that the name of Old Man Potter began circulating among the searchers in hushed, significant tones. Potter, the reclusive former gamekeeper who lived in a tumble-down cottage on the wood's edge, had always been regarded with suspicion by the more respectable villagers. "He's been acting stranger than usual lately," Mrs. Price confided to anyone who would listen, muttering to himself and chasing off walkers from his patch of the wood. "And you know how he feels about young women always thought they were up to no good." Inspector Craddock, though professionally skeptical of village gossip, found himself with precious few leads to follow. When the search parties returned empty-handed as evening approached, he dispatched P.C. Troughton to question Potter about his movements the previous afternoon. Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful as she observed the growing consensus around Potter's guilt. She had known the old gamekeeper for decades, gruff and solitary certainly, but hardly the calculating type who would arrange clandestine meetings using expensive hotel stationery. The evidence at the stile suggested something far more sophisticated than a chance encounter gone wrong. "It troubles me," she confided to Dr. Haydock as they walked back toward the village, "that Eleanor would linger at that stile if she truly intended to catch the 4:15 train, and to be looking back toward the village. As Tommy observed, that suggests she was expecting someone from Street Mary Mead, not simply pausing on her journey." Haydock nodded thoughtfully. "You believe she had arranged to meet someone?" "The evidence certainly points in that direction. The question is whether that meeting was Eleanor's idea or whether someone else orchestrated it for their own purposes." As they reached the village green, they encountered Mr. Pierce returning from his afternoon sketching expedition, his artist's satchel slung over his shoulder and that distinctive silver cigarette case visible in his breast pocket. He greeted them with his usual urbane charm, but Miss Marple noticed how his eyes flickered briefly toward Hangman's Wood before settling back on their faces. "Any luck with your search?" he inquired politely. "Dreadful business. A young woman disappearing like that. I do hope she's simply taken it into her head to extend her holiday somewhere." "That would be most unlike Miss Vance, Dr. Haydock replied. "She was quite particular about her commitments." Pierce's smile remained perfectly in place, but Miss Marple observed how he crushed his half-finished cigarette underfoot with unnecessary force quite different from his usual neat, precise habits. It was a small thing, but in her experience, small things often revealed the most about human nature under pressure. As evening settled over Street Mary Mead, the village buzzed with theories and suspicions. Old Man Potter had been questioned and released. His alibi of tending his vegetable garden confirmed by several neighbors who had seen him working there all afternoon. Yet the cigarette evidence pointed towards someone with more refined tastes, someone who could afford Turkish tobacco and might move in circles that included expensive London hotels. Miss Marple spent a restless evening considering the pieces of the puzzle. A young woman who left without her traveling hat received mysterious correspondence from the Cavendish Hotel and kept a secret appointment that led to her complete disappearance. Someone in their peaceful village was hiding a dangerous secret, and Eleanor Vance had somehow become a threat to that carefully maintained deception. The girl who never reached the station had indeed kept an appointment, but whether she had walked away from it or been prevented from doing so remained the central question that would require all of Miss Marple's understanding of human nature to answer. The following morning brought Inspector Craddock to the post office with the methodical determination that had earned him his reputation at Much Benham. Miss Marple, ostensibly there to purchase a packet of darning wool, found herself invited to remain in Mrs. Hart's small parlor while the postmistress consulted her meticulous records with the satisfaction of someone whose details were always in perfect order. The letter for Miss Vance bore a West End postmark, Mrs. Hart reported, adjusting her spectacles. Thick envelope, expensive paper with that embossed quality you find at the better establishments. The hand was masculine. I'd say neat block printing rather than cursive script. Inspector Craddock made careful notes. And were there any telephone calls to the Cedars yesterday? Mrs. Hart's expression grew more serious. Indeed, there were, Inspector. At precisely 10 minutes to 3, a trunk call came through from London asking for the Cedars, a woman's voice, refined and steady. Though she wouldn't leave her name. The message was quite specific. Tell Miss Vance to use the stile path much prettier than the dusty main road. She insisted on paying the trunk call fee immediately. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. How thoughtful of the caller to suggest a more scenic route. One might wonder how she knew about our local paths. At the Cedars, Mrs. Ainsworth confirmed receiving the mysterious message, her hands twisting her handkerchief with increasing agitation. Eleanor seemed surprised when I relayed it, perhaps even a little pleased. She said it would indeed be prettier than the main road, and left 10 minutes earlier than originally planned. The luggage receipt from Plumley's carrier, Inspector Craddock inquired. I assume that remained on the hall table? Mrs. Ainsworth's face grew pale. It was there after luncheon. I remember moving it from under the flower vase. But when I looked this morning, it had vanished completely. Eleanor must have taken it with her. This detail proved more significant than anyone had initially suspected. P.C. Troughton, methodically searching the hedgerow near the stile with a gardener's patience and a constable's thoroughness, discovered a small pasteboard ticket half buried beneath fallen leaves. The Milchester Station cloakroom check, numbered and stamped, had one corner bent as if hastily pocketed. Miss Vance's trunk remains unclaimed at Milchester, Inspector Craddock announced grimly to the assembled witnesses at the Blue Boar. If she possessed this ticket at the stile, then her journey to the station was indeed intended, but something diverted her from completing it. Mr. Pierce received them in the inn's lounge with his customary urbane charm, the afternoon light falling kindly on his well-manicured hands and the gleam of his silver cigarette case. Most distressing business, he declared with apparent sincerity. Though I fear I can offer little assistance. I spent yesterday afternoon sketching the old mill ruins, fascinating study in picturesque decay. The Egyptian cigarettes you favor, Inspector Craddock observed, seemingly casual. Rather uncommon in these parts. Pierce's smile remained perfectly composed. A harmless indulgence, though I confess my supply has been running rather low. He opened his cigarette case to reveal an assortment of ordinary domestic brands rather than the distinctive gold-tipped variety. Hard times, Inspector, one must economize where possible. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted not the cigarettes, but the walking stick propped beside Pierce's chair. Near the metal ferrule, a few pale blue threads had wound themselves around the shaft, so faint they might escape a less practiced observer. She said nothing, merely admiring aloud the elegant engraving on his cigarette case, while noting how Pierce's hand hesitated fractionally before snapping it shut. "Your sketches from yesterday?" Inspector Craddock requested. Pierce produced his drawing pad with a competent rendering of the mill, properly initialed and dated. The shadow angles appeared correct for late afternoon work, though Miss Marple observed that the paper felt slightly damp to the touch, unusual for work completed the previous day, unless the artist had applied a wash to fix the charcoal. As they prepared to leave, Pierce inquired with polite concern, "Any progress in locating the poor girl? I do hope she's simply extended her holiday somewhere and will turn up with a perfectly reasonable explanation." Outside the Blue Boar, Miss Marple walked thoughtfully beside Inspector Craddock. "Men who construct elaborate deceptions," she observed conversationally, "often anchor their lies with adjacent truths. Mr. Pierce may indeed have visited the mill yesterday, simply not when he claims." That afternoon brought another small but significant detail. Harold Higgins hurried up from the railway station with news that made Inspector Craddock's expression tighten considerably. "A gentleman telephoned asking about parcel collection procedures, Inspector. Wanted to know if someone else could claim luggage with a lost ticket. Rang off quickly when I asked for identification. Then someone wants that trunk," Craddock concluded grimly. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the emerging pattern. Pierce made an obvious suspect, the sophisticated stranger with expensive tastes and suspicious behavior. Yet in her long experience of human nature, she had learned that obvious suspects often serve to obscure more complex truths. "It concerns me," she confided to Dr. Haydock as evening approached, "that we may be seeing precisely what someone wishes us to see." A mysterious phone call directing Eleanor to a secluded path, expensive cigarettes left conveniently at the scene, and a charming antique dealer whose alibi has just enough flaws to seem suspicious. Dr. Haydock nodded thoughtfully. "You believe Pierce is being deliberately implicated?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that someone in Street Mary Mead understands human nature well enough to construct a very convincing deception. The question is whether Mr. Pierce is the architect of that deception or merely its most convenient victim." As darkness settled over the village, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. A young woman had been deliberately diverted from her intended path by someone who knew both her plans and the local geography intimately. Whether Pierce was the orchestrator of Eleanor's disappearance or simply a carefully selected scapegoat remained to be determined. But one thing had become increasingly clear. Someone in their peaceful village possessed both the cunning to plan such an elaborate deception and the ruthlessness to carry it through to its conclusion. The girl who never reached the station had been caught in a web far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected, a web that might ensnare the innocent as easily as the guilty if Miss Marple couldn't untangle the truth from the carefully constructed lies. The third day of Eleanor's disappearance dawned grey and drizzling, the sort of persistent English weather that seemed to mirror the village's increasingly somber mood. Inspector Craddock had spent the early hours coordinating with Scotland Yard regarding the Cavendish Hotel inquiry, and by mid-morning he had assembled the key witnesses in the Blue Boar's private dining room to share his findings. Miss Marple arrived punctually, her knitting bag in hand and her sharp eyes already noting the subtle changes in familiar faces. Mrs. Ainsworth appeared particularly drawn, her usual theatrical manner replaced by a brittle composure that suggested sleepless nights. Colonel Ainsworth maintained his military bearing, though Miss Marple observed how his hands remained clasped behind his back in a way that concealed their slight tremor. "The trunk at Milchester Station has been examined thoroughly," Inspector Craddock announced without preamble. Miss Vance's belongings reveal nothing unusual: modest clothing, a few well-worn books, the typical possessions of a governess. However, The Cavendish Hotel has provided more intriguing information. He consulted his notebook with deliberate precision. A room was indeed reserved for Eleanor Vance, but not by the employment agency, as we might have expected. The booking was made by telephone, under the name of a Mr. Richard Fleming, with payment sent by postal order from a village in Kent. The name hung in the air, like morning mist. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly as she watched the faces around her. Mrs. Ainsworth's already pale complexion grew ashen, while Mr. Pierce shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Richard Fleming, Dr. Haydock repeated thoughtfully. Rather a common name. Could be anyone. Precisely the point, Inspector Craddock replied. Someone who wished to remain untraceable. Postal orders can be purchased with cash, leaving no direct connection to the sender. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. Inspector, might I inquire whether the hotel has confirmed any other details about this Mr. Fleming? His appearance, perhaps, or any distinguishing characteristics? Unfortunately, the booking was made entirely by telephone and post. However, they did mention that their stationery had been requested by a lady from the country the previous week, several sheets of their best letterhead, taken from the writing room. Mrs. Ainsworth's teacup rattled against its saucer with sufficient force to draw everyone's attention. How clumsy of me, she murmured, dabbing at a small spill with her handkerchief. This dreadful business has left me quite unsettled. But Miss Marple had noticed something more significant than spilled tea. When Mrs. Ainsworth reached for her handkerchief, her handbag fell open slightly, revealing the corner of what appeared to be expensive hotel stationery. The distinctive cream color and embossed quality of the Cavendish Hotel's writing paper. Mrs. Ainsworth, Miss Marple ventured with her characteristic gentle directness. I believe you mentioned visiting London recently for the Colonel's dental appointment? A brief trip, Mrs. Ainsworth replied quickly. One night only. We stayed at the Cavendish, such a respectable establishment. Inspector Craddock made a careful note. And during this visit, did you happen to use the hotel's writing facilities? The question seemed to hang in the air longer than necessary. Mrs. Ainsworth's fingers worried the edge of her handkerchief, while Colonel Ainsworth's jaw tightened visibly. I may have written a few letters, she admitted finally. One does like to use quality stationery when it's available. The revelation cast Eleanor's mysterious correspondence in an entirely different light. If Mrs. Ainsworth had access to Cavendish Hotel stationery, then the letter that had arrived on the morning of Eleanor's departure might not have come from London at all, but from much closer to home. Miss Marple found herself recalling Eleanor's subdued manner at breakfast, her quick reading of the letter, and her decision to tuck it away without comment. Mrs. Ainsworth, did Eleanor seem familiar with your handwriting? As her employer, you would have corresponded with her previously about her position. Naturally, Mrs. Ainsworth replied, though her voice had grown noticeably strained, though Eleanor was already in residence when we engaged her services. There was little need for extensive correspondence. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with renewed interest. How exactly did you come to employ Miss Vance? Through an agency, I assume, the Colonel answered before his wife could speak. Eleanor came with excellent references from her previous position with the Whitmore family in Surrey. The arrangement was made through mutual acquaintances, quite satisfactory all around. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm, but her mind was working with increasing clarity. A governess with excellent references, yet a position that had ended rather suddenly. A mysterious letter on hotel stationery that Mrs. Ainsworth had access to. A telephone call directing Eleanor to take the scenic route through the woods, made by someone who knew the local paths intimately. The Whitmore family, she mused aloud. Such a distinguished name. I believe there was some unpleasantness in the newspapers last spring, something involving art forgeries and insurance matters. Mrs. Ainsworth's teacup clattered to the floor, shattering against the flagstones with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. How terribly clumsy, she whispered. staring at the broken pieces as if they held some terrible significance. Inspector Craddock's expression had grown considerably more serious. "Mrs. Ainsworth, I think it would be best if you told us exactly what you know about Eleanor Vance's previous employment and why she left the Whitmore household so suddenly." The silence stretched uncomfortably before Mrs. Ainsworth finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor witnessed something she shouldn't have. The Whitmores were involved in irregularities, forged provenance papers, insurance claims on pieces that had been secretly sold. Eleanor's testimony could have sent several people to prison. But the matter was handled quietly," Colonel Ainsworth added quickly. "No charges were brought. Eleanor simply needed to find new employment, somewhere far from Surrey." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though not the one she had initially expected. Eleanor hadn't simply disappeared, she had been silenced by someone who feared what she might reveal. But the question remained. Was that someone Mr. Pierce, the convenient outsider? Or was the truth much closer to home? "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we need to discover exactly what Eleanor Vance knew about the Whitmore affair, and more importantly, who else might have been involved in those irregularities. Because I suspect that Eleanor's disappearance has very little to do with Mr. Pierce's cigarettes or walking stick, and everything to do with secrets that someone in Street Mary Mead was desperate to keep buried." As the grey afternoon light filtered through the inn's windows, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. The girl who never reached the station had been carrying more than just luggage. She had been carrying knowledge that someone was willing to kill to protect. The question now was whether Eleanor was still alive somewhere, hidden away until the danger passed, or whether that knowledge had already cost her everything. The silence that followed Mrs. Ainsworth's confession about Eleanor's connection to the Whitmore scandal stretched uncomfortably before Inspector Craddock cleared his throat with professional authority. "Mrs. Ainsworth, I'll need you to provide a complete statement about Miss Vance's previous employment and the circumstances of her departure from Surrey." Before Mrs. Ainsworth could respond, young Timothy Hart burst through the inn's door with the breathless urgency that only village postboys could muster. "Inspector, sir, Gran sent me with this. It came yesterday afternoon for Miss Vance, but she'd already gone by then. Foreign stamp, it has." Inspector Craddock accepted the delayed letter with careful hands, noting the continental postmark and expensive paper. He slit the envelope with official precision, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read the brief contents aloud. "Eleanor, do not meet him. He is not who he claims to be. The Whitmore matter has not ended as quietly as we hoped. If you must speak with anyone, ensure others can see you. I write in great haste from Nice. Your friend, N.W." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused entirely. "Nora Whitmore, I presume? The youngest daughter who went abroad for her health after the unpleasantness?" Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "A nervous disposition, but sharp as a tack when it came to family business. If she's writing warnings from the continent, the situation is more serious than anyone admitted. The implications of the letter cast Eleanor's disappearance in an entirely different light. Someone had been using a false identity to arrange a meeting with Eleanor, and that someone had knowledge of both her past involvement with the Whitmores and her current location in Street Mary Mead. Within the hour, the investigation took another dramatic turn. P.C. Troughton arrived with Harold Higgins from the railway station, both men bearing news that made Inspector Craddock's jaw tighten visibly. "There was an attempt on Miss Vance's trunk last night," Higgins reported, still slightly out of breath from his bicycle ride. "A gentleman came after closing, claimed he'd mislaid his collection ticket. Knew the number well enough, but got 2 digits wrong when pressed. When I asked for proper identification, he bolted like a rabbit." Troughton produced a single dark leather glove from his pocket. "Dropped this in his haste, Inspector. Quality workmanship, not the sort worn by local folk." Miss Marple examined the glove with the careful attention she might give to a particularly intricate stitch. The leather carried a faint but distinctive scent of beeswax polish, and caught in the interior seam were several pale blue fibers that matched the threads they'd found at the stile. Beeswax polish, she observed conversationally. Not the common variety one finds at the village shop, but the French preparation that Mrs. Ainsworth favors for the Colonel's regimental silver. I helped her unpack a shipment last winter, such a clean, distinctive fragrance. Mrs. Ainsworth's face went ashen, but before anyone could comment further, little Mavis Crewe came running from the direction of the churchyard, her pinafore flying and her face flushed with the importance of discovery. P.C. Troughton. I found something under the Lichgate ivy, something that doesn't belong. The leather handbag that Mavis had discovered proved to be Eleanor's, its clasp broken and edges damp from the morning dew. Inside, the contents told a story of increasing desperation and deception. Along with Eleanor's usual possessions, compact, lipstick, a small purse with 2 shillings, they found 2 notes that made Inspector Craddock's expression grow increasingly grim. The first, written on Cavendish Hotel stationery in neat block capitals, read, "Take Stile Path at 3:40, much prettier than the main road. R. F." The second, hastily scrawled on blue-bore letterhead in an entirely different hand, instructed, "Change of plan. Mill ruins at 4. Don't be seen." 2 different people, Miss Marple observed quietly, studying the handwriting samples. The first note matches the style Mrs. Hart described for Eleanor's morning correspondence. The second appears to have been written by someone in considerable haste or considerable agitation. Mr. Pierce, when questioned about the inn's stationery, maintained his urbane composure. "Anyone might have used the writing paper, Inspector. We keep it freely available in the lounge for guests and visitors alike. The vicar often borrows a sheet when the telephone requires notes." But Miss Marple had noticed something else in Eleanor's handbag, a small photograph of a Renaissance painting, stamped Whitmore Collection on the reverse, showing a young woman wearing an elaborate necklace with a distinctive blue enamel pendant. "Mrs. Ainsworth?" she inquired gently. "When Eleanor left the Whitmore household, did she perhaps receive any token of appreciation for her discretion? A small remembrance, perhaps?" Mrs. Ainsworth's hands twisted her handkerchief with increasing agitation. "Mrs. Whitmore did give Eleanor a locket, a family piece," she said. "Renaissance work with blue enamel. She mentioned it might serve as security should Eleanor ever find herself in difficulties." The revelation transformed their understanding once again. Eleanor hadn't simply been carrying dangerous knowledge, she had been carrying physical evidence that could link the Whitmores to their fraudulent activities. That afternoon, a small party made their way to the mill ruins. Inspector Craddock, P.C. Troughton, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple. Despite protests about the unstable stonework, the ancient structure crouched beside the stream like a sleeping beast, its broken wheel casting skeletal shadows on the dark water. Inside the ruins, recent disturbance was clearly visible in the dust patterns. 2 sets of footprints led to the collapsed inner stair, one heavier and more authoritative, the other lighter and more hesitant. On the stone steps, Inspector Craddock's lamp revealed scrape marks and a thin, dark stain that made everyone's breath catch. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught additional details that spoke of careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. 3 neat drops of candle wax on the windowsill suggested someone who preferred proper illumination for delicate work. Caught on a splinter near the broken banister, more pale blue threads fluttered like tiny flags of evidence. "Whoever arranged this meeting," Miss Marple observed as they prepared to leave the ruins, understood the mill's layout well enough to navigate it safely, yet felt the need for artificial light. Someone familiar with the location but not entirely comfortable in its shadows. As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple found herself considering the emerging pattern with growing unease. Eleanor had been systematically deceived by someone who knew her past, her plans, and her current circumstances intimately. The expensive cigarettes, the hotel's stationery, the careful timing of telephone calls, all suggested a level of sophistication that went far beyond village gossip or casual opportunism. The girl who never reached the station had been caught in a web of deception that stretched from the Surrey scandal to the ancient mill ruins of Street Mary Mead. But as Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries, she couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous thread in that web was one that had been hiding in plain sight all along, woven so carefully into the fabric of village life that no one had thought to examine it closely until now. Someone in their peaceful community possessed both the knowledge to orchestrate Eleanor's disappearance and the ruthlessness to carry it through to its conclusion. The question that haunted Miss Marple as evening approached was whether Eleanor's silence had been purchased with promises and threats, or whether it had been ensured by means far more permanent and final. The morning brought news that transformed the investigation from methodical inquiry into urgent pursuit. Harold Higgins arrived at the police station with the breathless urgency of a man who had discovered that careful procedures meant nothing against determined criminals. During the night, Eleanor's trunk had been removed from Milchester Station's cloakroom with professional efficiency. No locks forced, no windows broken, simply the quiet use of a duplicate key, while the night clerk had been conveniently summoned away by a forged telegram. Signed the register as R. Fleming. Higgins reported to Inspector Craddock, his hands still trembling slightly from the morning's discoveries. Bold as brass, he was, according to the porter who glimpsed him wheeling the trunk away. Knew exactly where the duplicate key was kept and when the clerk would be absent. Miss Marple, arriving at the station with her knitting bag and that particular air of being helpful without intruding, found herself considering the implications of such intimate knowledge. The sort of familiarity, she observed gently, that comes not from observation, but from genuine acquaintance with railway procedures. Someone who has made inquiries over time, perhaps even visited the station on legitimate business. The investigation took another significant turn when young Timothy Hart appeared with information that cast Eleanor's disappearance in an entirely different light. Gran found this in the church poor box after early prayers, he announced, producing an envelope addressed to Miss Marple in Eleanor's neat governess handwriting. The letter inside, written with characteristic precision, revealed Eleanor's intelligence and foresight. If the man using the name Richard Fleming presses for a private meeting, I shall not go unless others may see me. If I am obliged to leave my handbag at the church as a signal, it will mean I am being followed. The locket is safe for now. If anything happens, please tell Nora Whitmore that I kept my promise. Inspector Craddock studied the letter with growing respect for the missing governess. She anticipated danger and took precautions. The handbag at the latchgate wasn't dropped in panic, it was deliberately placed as a warning signal. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, noting the careful phrasing. Eleanor writes that the locket is safe, which suggests she had hidden it somewhere secure, away from her person. A sensible young woman who expected to be searched. Their discussion was interrupted by Mr. Pierce's appearance in the station's small office, his usual urbane composure replaced by something approaching resignation. Inspector, I believe the time has come for complete honesty. My name is Randall Field, and I am employed by Consolidated Insurance to investigate certain irregularities connected to the Whitmore affair. The revelation recontextualized much of Pierce's suspicious behavior. His expensive tastes, his knowledge of the case, even his presence in Street Mary Mead, all became explicable when viewed through the lens of professional investigation rather than criminal intent. The Egyptian cigarettes, the walking stick, even my interest in Eleanor Vance, all genuine, Field explained. But I did not write to her or arrange any meeting. I came here because our London office received information that the Whitmore locket might surface in this area. Miss Marple listened with particular attention to Field's account of observing the mill ruins from the lane. You saw someone enter the mill at 4 o'clock? A woman in pale clothing, cream or white, I thought. No hat. Then a heavier figure joined her. I maintained my distance, watching for the locket rather than intervening. His professional shame was evident. I failed to prevent whatever occurred inside those ruins. With Field's explanation, clarifying his role as investigator rather than perpetrator, Miss Marple found her attention drawn increasingly toward the Cedars and its inhabitants. That afternoon, she paid a social call on Mrs. Ainsworth, ostensibly to inquire after her nerves following the previous day's distressing revelations. She found Mrs. Ainsworth in the drawing room, nervously arranging late asters with hands that trembled despite her efforts at composure. Colonel Ainsworth had departed for Milchester on urgent business, leaving his wife alone with her increasingly fragile facade. Such a shock for everyone. Miss Marple began gently, settling into her chair with her knitting. Poor Eleanor was always so discreet about her past difficulties. The Whitmore affair must have been terribly distressing for a young woman of her principles. Mrs. Ainsworth started visibly, nearly dropping the flowers she was arranging. Discreet, yes. We valued that quality highly when we engaged her services. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she observed Mrs. Ainsworth's increasing agitation. Such unfortunate business, art forgeries, and insurance irregularities. One can understand why someone involved might wish to ensure that certain details remained buried. The temptation to take decisive action must be considerable when one's reputation or perhaps one's freedom hangs in the balance. The vase of asters crashed to the floor, water and petals scattering across the polished boards. Mrs. Ainsworth stared at the mess with something approaching horror, as if the broken flowers represented the collapse of more than mere decoration. "How clumsy," she whispered, kneeling to gather the scattered blooms. "I seem to be quite undone by all this unpleasantness." Miss Marple rose to assist, her sharp eyes noting the ornate silver box on a nearby table, the source of that distinctive beeswax fragrance that had clung to the glove found at the railway station. French beeswax polish, she observed conversationally. Such a particular scent. I noticed it on the glove dropped by whoever attempted to claim Eleanor's trunk. The colonel maintains his regimental silver beautifully. Mrs. Ainsworth's hands stilled among the wet petals. The color drained from her face as the implications of Miss Marple's gentle observation settled over her like a shroud. And that Renaissance locket Eleanor carried. Miss Marple continued softly. Such a unique piece. Mrs. Whitmore must have valued Eleanor's discretion highly to part with such a treasure, or perhaps it served as insurance, a guarantee that certain secrets would remain safely buried. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and crumbling pretenses. Mrs. Ainsworth's carefully constructed composure was visibly fracturing, revealing the desperate fear that had driven her to increasingly dangerous measures. "People can be so ruthless," Mrs. Ainsworth finally whispered, her voice barely audible, "when their backs are against the wall, when everything they've worked for hangs by such a slender thread." Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding, though her pale blue eyes remained sharp and unforgiving. "Indeed, my dear, desperation can drive people to extraordinary lengths. The question that remains is whether Eleanor Vance had discovered just how far someone was prepared to go to protect their secrets." As the afternoon light faded through the drawing-room windows, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that had finally emerged. The girl who never reached the station had been caught in a web of deception, spun by someone who understood that the best way to commit murder was to ensure that everyone looked elsewhere for the killer. But even the most carefully constructed lies contained threads of truth, and Miss Marple had finally begun to pull at the right ones. The confrontation had planted its seeds in Mrs. Ainsworth's guilty conscience. Soon, Miss Marple knew, the full truth about Eleanor's fate would emerge along with the identity of the person who had orchestrated her disappearance with such calculated precision. The evening shadows lengthened across the cedars as Mrs. Ainsworth knelt among the scattered asters, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but relentless observations. The broken vase lay in fragments around her, water seeping into the Persian carpet, but she seemed oblivious to everything except the terrible certainty that her secrets were no longer safe. French beeswax polish, Miss Marple repeated softly, watching Mrs. Ainsworth's trembling hands. Such a distinctive scent. I noticed it at the railway station as well, clinging to a glove that someone dropped in their haste to claim Eleanor's trunk. Mrs. Ainsworth's face went ashen. I don't understand what you're suggesting, she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Perhaps we should examine Eleanor's room once more, Miss Marple suggested with characteristic mildness. Sometimes the most important clues hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. In Eleanor's small chamber under the eaves, Miss Marple moved with the deliberate care of someone who understood that truth often resided in the smallest details. The room appeared exactly as before, bed made with governess-like precision. Books stacked tidily, lavender still fresh in its chipped vase. But Miss Marple's experienced eye caught what others had missed. How curious, she murmured, running her finger along the table beneath the vase. There's a faint ring of dampness here, but it's been disturbed recently. The vase has been moved and replaced, though not quite in its original position. With gentle precision, she lifted the small ceramic vessel. Inside its hollow base, wrapped in oiled paper, lay a tiny brass key and a torn corner of paper bearing 2 words in Eleanor's neat handwriting, North Screen. Summoned by Mrs. Ainsworth's increasingly agitated state, arrived to find Miss Marple examining the key with professional interest. The church, she explained simply. Eleanor was far too intelligent to carry dangerous evidence on her person. She would have hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere that required both knowledge and courage to access. Within the hour, a small party had assembled in Street Mary Mead's ancient church. The vicar, bewildered but cooperative, led them to the north section of the rood screen, with his lantern casting dancing shadows across the carved oak panels. The restoration work after Easter, Miss Marple observed, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings until she found what she sought. A poppy whose seed head felt slightly raised. A gentle pressure revealed a hidden mechanism, and behind the sliding panel, a keyhole gleamed in the lamplight. The brass key turned with reluctant precision, revealing a small cavity that held treasures worth far more than their material value. Wrapped in a strip of altar linen lay the Renaissance locket, an oval of gold and blue enamel that seemed to pulse with significance in the flickering light. Beside it, a folded paper bore an insurance company watermark and a neat list of initials with monetary amounts that made Inspector Craddock's breath catch. Payout records, he murmured grimly. Enough evidence to implicate 6 people who swore they knew nothing about the Whitmore irregularities. Miss Marple handled the locket with careful reverence. Eleanor kept her promise to the very end. She hid the evidence where prying hands would hesitate to search, in the house of God, where truth is meant to reside. Their discovery had not gone unnoticed. As they prepared to leave through the vestry door, a figure detached itself from the porch shadows with desperate urgency. Gloved hands reached for the locket with the desperation of someone whose very survival depended on possessing it. The struggle was brief but violent. Inspector Craddock and the mysterious intruder grappled in the narrow aisle, their movements casting wild shadows across the ancient stones. The attacker fought with the fury of desperation before breaking free and bolting through the south door into the night. P.C. Troughton, despite his best efforts, returned empty-handed from the pursuit. But he carried evidence that spoke volumes, a silver cufflink bearing a regimental crest, its surface still warm from the struggle and carrying that distinctive scent of beeswax polish that had become a signature of deception. Colonel Ainsworth's regiment, Inspector Craddock observed grimly. Yet he swore he had departed for Milchester on urgent business. The station master confirms he never arrived on any train. The evening brought additional discoveries that transformed their understanding of Eleanor's fate. Young Tommy Fletcher arrived breathless with news that sent search parties scrambling toward the old weir. Old Man Potter had found a silk scarf caught in the brambles, pale cream silk that matched Eleanor's traveling dress, along with a tortoiseshell comb that showed signs of having been violently pulled free. Back at the Cedars, they found Mrs. Ainsworth waiting in the hallway, her face composed to an icy serenity that failed to conceal the terror in her eyes. "My husband is not at home," she announced before anyone could ask. "He received urgent news regarding regimental matters and departed for London immediately." "How convenient," Inspector Craddock replied, producing the silver cufflink, "though he appears to have left this behind during his hasty departure." Mrs. Ainsworth stared at the evidence with the expression of someone watching her world collapse. "I tried to warn him," she whispered. "I told him Eleanor was too intelligent, too principled to be frightened into silence. But he wouldn't listen. He said there was too much at stake, too many people depending on our discretion." Miss Marple settled into a chair with her knitting, her pale blue eyes never leaving Mrs. Ainsworth's face. "Perhaps you could tell us about your brother, my dear. Arthur, wasn't it? The one who disappeared so suddenly after the Whitmore affair became public?" The question struck like lightning. Mrs. Ainsworth's careful composure shattered completely, and she sank into the nearest chair with the boneless collapse of someone whose strength had finally abandoned her. "Arthur was the architect of it all," she confessed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "The forged provenance papers, the false insurance claims, everything. When Eleanor arrived from the Whitmore household, I knew she had seen too much, knew too much. The locket wasn't just a gift from Mrs. Whitmore. It contained evidence that could destroy what remained of our family's reputation." "So you wrote to Eleanor using the Cavendish Hotel stationery," Miss Marple observed gently, attempting to convince her that staying silent would be in everyone's best interest. Mrs. Ainsworth nodded miserably. "But Eleanor was too honorable. She spoke of duty and truth and the importance of justice. She wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't accept that some secrets are better left buried." Inspector Craddock leaned forward with professional intensity. "And when persuasion failed, more direct measures became necessary?" "I only wanted to retrieve the locket," Mrs. Ainsworth protested weakly. "I arranged to meet her at the stile, hoping to negotiate. But she brought the evidence with her, intending to use it as leverage. When I couldn't convince her, I sent word to my husband, asking for his help." The confession hung in the air like morning mist, revealing the outline of truth while still concealing its most terrible details. Mrs. Ainsworth had admitted to deception and conspiracy, but the final, darkest secret remained locked behind her trembling lips. Miss Marple folded her knitting with deliberate precision, her mind working through the implications of Mrs. Ainsworth's partial confession. The girl who never reached the station had indeed been caught in a web of family secrets and financial desperation, but the full extent of that web's deadly reach remained to be revealed. As the evening deepened around the Cedars, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that had finally emerged. Eleanor Vance had been a young woman of principle who had discovered that integrity could be a dangerous luxury in a world where reputation and financial security hung by the slenderest of threads. Someone had decided that Eleanor's silence was worth more than her life, and tomorrow would bring the final reckoning for that terrible calculation. The evidence was gathered, the participants identified, and the stage set for the final confrontation. All that remained was to determine whether Colonel Ainsworth would return to face the consequences of his actions, or whether justice would need to pursue him to whatever refuge he had sought in his desperate flight from the truth. The morning brought Colonel Ainsworth back to street. Mary Mead, with the inexorable certainty of a man who understood that flight merely postponed the inevitable. Miss Marple, with the quiet authority that had guided the entire investigation, suggested a small gathering at the vicarage under the pretext of returning the Renaissance locket to its proper custodians before the authorities claimed it as evidence. By afternoon, the vicar's drawing room had filled with careful purpose. Inspector Craddock stood near the mantel with professional alertness. while P.C. Troughton positioned himself strategically by the door. Mrs. Ainsworth sat rigidly beside her husband, her face pale but resigned to whatever revelation awaited. Randall Field, the insurance investigator, completed the circle with his notebook and the air of someone who had seen too many such confrontations to be surprised by human weakness. Miss Marple occupied her customary chair near the window, her knitting bag beside her, and the Renaissance locket displayed prominently on a small side table. The afternoon light caught its blue enamel surface, making it seem to pulse with significance in the quiet room. "Such a beautiful piece," Miss Marple began conversationally, her pale blue eyes moving from face to face. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary, particularly the hidden mechanism that opens the secret compartment. The vicar's housekeeper discovered it quite by accident when cleaning." She lifted the locket with gentle reverence. "The spring catch is remarkably well concealed. Most people would press the obvious clasp, but the true mechanism lies just to the left of the hinge. Quite ingenious, really." Colonel Ainsworth's military bearing remained intact, but Miss Marple noticed how his eyes fixed on the locket with unmistakable familiarity. "Renaissance craftsmen were indeed clever," he observed with casual authority. "The best pieces always had such hidden features." "How knowledgeable you are, Colonel," Miss Marple replied with gentle admiration, "though I confess I'm puzzled how you came to know the precise location of this particular catch. The mechanism is so well hidden that even the insurance investigator required considerable examination to discover it." The silence that followed carried the weight of recognition. Inspector Craddock leaned forward slightly, his professional instincts sharpened by the subtle shift in atmosphere. "Perhaps," Miss Marple continued with characteristic mildness, "you encountered a similar piece during your military service? Though this locket has been in Eleanor's possession since leaving the Whitmore household, and before that, locked away in their private collection for decades." Colonel Ainsworth's composure began to crack under the gentle but relentless pressure. "I may have examined it briefly when Eleanor first arrived. Curiosity about a family heirloom." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Though Eleanor was remarkably protective of her possessions, she kept the locket hidden in the church. You know, along with the insurance documents that detailed the entire Whitmore network. Such a cautious young woman, she understood that carrying such evidence would make her a target. The Colonel's face went ashen as the implications settled over him. Mrs. Ainsworth reached for his arm with trembling fingers, her own realization dawning with terrible clarity. "You knew about the hidden compartment," Inspector Craddock stated with quiet authority, "because you forced Eleanor to open it during your confrontation at the mill ruins. You needed to verify that she possessed the evidence before you decided how to proceed." The confession that followed came with military precision, as if the Colonel were filing a final report. Eleanor had indeed accompanied him to the mill ruins, still believing negotiation was possible. But when she produced the locket and demonstrated its contents, detailed records of forged provenance papers and fraudulent insurance claims, the Colonel realized that half measures would no longer suffice. "She was inflexible," he admitted, his voice heavy with bitter memory. "She spoke of duty and justice as absolute principles, regardless of the consequences for innocent families caught in Arthur's web of deception. When I realized she could not be swayed, I acted with the decisiveness that military training demands. The struggle at the mill had been brief but violent. Eleanor, realizing her danger too late, had fought with desperate courage before succumbing to the Colonel's superior strength. Her body had been carried to the weir under cover of darkness, consigned to the deep waters that would hide the evidence of his crime. The trunk at Milchester, the planted evidence against Mr. Field, even the elaborate deception with the hotel stationery, all designed to create a mystery without a body. Miss Marple observed with quiet sadness. "You understood that without Eleanor's testimony, the insurance investigation would eventually fade away." As Inspector Craddock prepared the formal charges, Colonel Ainsworth rose with military bearing intact even in defeat. Mrs. Ainsworth followed with the resigned dignity of someone who had finally stopped running from the consequences of desperate choices. Miss Marple remained seated as the official party departed, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. The girl who never reached the station had finally received justice. Eleanor Vance had died defending principles that her killer considered naive idealism. But in Miss Marple's long experience of human nature, such courage was both rare and precious. The Renaissance locket, now evidence in a murder case, would eventually find its way to a museum where its beauty could be appreciated without the shadow of violence. But Eleanor's true legacy lay not in the artifact she had protected, but in the unwavering integrity that had cost her everything, yet ultimately brought her killer to justice. The departure of Colonel and Mrs. Ainsworth from the vicarage marked the end of deception, but the beginning of a deeper reckoning for Street Mary Mead. Inspector Craddock led the colonel away. His military bearing finally crumbled under the weight of his terrible confession, while Mrs. Ainsworth followed with the resigned dignity of someone whose burden of secrets had finally been lifted, however devastating the cost. Miss Marple remained in the vicar's drawing room as the official party departed, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while she processed the tragic conclusion of Eleanor Vance's story. The Renaissance locket, now evidence in a murder case, caught the afternoon light from its place on the side table, a beautiful artifact forever tainted by the violence it had inspired. The following morning brought the grim confirmation that everyone had dreaded, yet expected. The search of the weir, conducted with quiet efficiency by men whose faces bore the solemnity of their task, yielded Eleanor's body from the dark water that had concealed it for nearly a week. P.C. Troughton stood guard with grave respect as Dr. Haydock supervised the melancholy work, his professional examination confirming every detail of the colonel's confession. "She fought bravely to the end," Dr. Haydock reported with professional sadness. "The physical evidence corroborates the struggle at the mill ruins. Eleanor Vance died as she lived, refusing to compromise her principles even when it cost her everything." The tortoiseshell comb was still tangled in her hair, and the pale cream scarf bore tears consistent with violent struggle. There was no locket at her throat. Of course, Eleanor's foresight in hiding that crucial evidence in the church had ensured that her killer's crime would not remain hidden forever. Randall Field, the insurance investigator whose presence had initially cast suspicion in the wrong direction, spent the afternoon examining the evidence Eleanor had died to protect. The documents hidden behind the church's rood screen revealed a network of fraud that extended far beyond the original Surrey scandal, implicating dealers, appraisers, and collectors across 3 counties. Eleanor's testimony would have been devastating, Field explained to Miss Marple as they walked through the village that evening. Not just to the Ainsworths, but to dozens of people who thought they had escaped consequences when the Whitmore investigation was quietly closed. The colonel wasn't simply protecting his wife's brother, he was safeguarding an entire criminal network. Before departing Street Mary Mead, Field stopped at Miss Marple's cottage to express his professional gratitude. "I learned a great deal here, Miss Marple," he admitted with genuine respect. "Perhaps I shall pay more attention to the quiet observers in future cases. Your understanding of human nature proved far more valuable than all my investigative techniques." Among Eleanor's belongings at the Cedars, investigators discovered a letter she had written but never sent, addressed to her sister in Yorkshire. The contents provided heartbreaking insight into her final days and the growing awareness of her dangerous situation. "I fear I have walked into a spider's web," Eleanor had written in her neat governess script. "The very people who offered me sanctuary may be the ones from whom I most need protection. The Whitmore affair follows me like a shadow, and I begin to suspect that my employment here was not the refuge I believed it to be. If anything happens to me, please know that I tried to do what was right, even when the cost became too high to bear." The letter revealed Eleanor's intelligence and moral courage in stark relief. She had realized too late that her position at the Cedars was not escape from the conspiracy but entrapment within it. Yet she had chosen integrity over safety, even when she understood the mortal danger she faced. News of the colonel's arrest spread through Street Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that accompanies shocking revelations in small communities. The Harvest Festival, only days ago, a symbol of their peaceful existence, now seemed like an innocent memory from a more trusting time. Whispers turned to gasps, then to horrified certainty as the full scope of the deception became clear. Mrs. Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon, her face pale and her usual composure shaken. "To think, Jane, such a distinguished man, a pillar of our community, and poor Eleanor, dying simply for knowing too much and refusing to stay silent." "People are rarely what they seem, my dear," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, her needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. "Especially those who strive the hardest to appear impeccable. The more tightly one draws the veil of respectability, the more one often has to hide beneath it." The village struggled to reconcile their image of the colonel, his meticulously maintained garden, his precise military bearing, his dignified presence at church services, with the reality of his crime. Every polite conversation, every casual interaction was now re-examined through the lens of his terrible secret. Mrs. Price sent flowers to the church and reminded everyone, with characteristic village loyalty, that Old Man Potter had spent that crucial afternoon tending his vegetable garden, witnessed by several neighbors. The elderly gamekeeper, initially suspected due to village prejudice, received quiet apologies and renewed respect for his simple honesty. Harold Higgins at the railway station methodically oiled a stubborn hinge until it moved silently again, finding comfort in the notion that things working as they ought could be a form of mercy. The practical details of life continued, providing structure around which the community could rebuild its sense of security. In the quiet of late afternoon, Dr. Haydock walked with Miss Marple along the hedge where the first blue threads had caught on thorns, beginning the unraveling of the colonel's carefully constructed deception. "You saw through it very early," he observed, "before any of us suspected. What revealed the truth to you?" "Oh, my dear doctor," Miss Marple replied with gentle patience, "people tell one everything, if one simply listens carefully. The hat that Mrs. Ainsworth insisted Eleanor wore, yet hung undisturbed on its peg. The letter on hotel paper that the lady of the house had access to. The telephone call directing Eleanor to take the scenic route, made by someone who knew our local paths intimately. The blue threads planted on Mr. Field's walking stick, theatrical, but rather too obvious. The beeswax polish scent on the glove, domestic and specific, not the fragrance of a passing stranger. Men like the colonel anchor their deceptions in adjacent truths, which makes them both convincing and ultimately detectable." "Her courage," Dr. Haydock said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed with quiet admiration. Eleanor thought of others, even in her final moments, hiding the evidence in the church, leaving signals for those who would seek justice. One can tell a great deal about a person's character by observing where they choose to hide their most precious treasures. The funeral was simple, conducted with the dignity that Eleanor's courage deserved. The vicar spoke of conscience and truth, while a robin sang from the ancient yew tree, no respecter of human solemnities. Afterwards, Miss Marple stood apart, as the villagers formed their gentle procession back to ordinary time, each carrying the memory of a young woman who had died rather than compromise her principles. As autumn deepened into winter, Street Mary Mead resumed its quiet rhythms, though the village carried a new awareness of the hidden depths that could exist beneath familiar facades. The cedars would be sold to settle legal expenses, eventually finding new owners who would fill it with happier memories. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving with meditative precision as she reflected on the complex patterns of human behavior that had once again revealed themselves in her quiet corner of England. The girl who never reached the station had completed her final journey to justice, though it had come too late to save her life. Eleanor Vance had died defending principles that her killer dismissed as naive idealism, but Miss Marple knew that such moral courage, however costly, was what separated civilization from chaos. In a world too often governed by expedience and self-interest, Eleanor's unwavering integrity deserved to be remembered and honored. Life, like knitting, could sometimes be corrected if one was willing to pull back far enough and begin again. Not always, of course. Some dropped stitches could never be recovered, however nimble the hands. It was then, Miss Marple reflected, that one must make the pattern hold all the same, finding beauty and meaning even in the presence of irreparable loss. The Renaissance locket would eventually find its way to a museum, where its beauty could be appreciated without the shadow of violence. But Eleanor's true legacy lay not in the artifact she had protected, but in the unwavering courage that had ultimately brought her killer to justice and reminded a peaceful village that truth, however dangerous, must never be sacrificed to convenience or fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and perhaps new mysteries, but tonight Miss Marple was content to honor the memory of a brave young governess whose principles had proven stronger than the forces arrayed against her. The girl who never reached the station had, in the end, arrived exactly where she needed to be in the hearts and consciences of those who would ensure that justice, though delayed, would never be denied. The swiftness with which justice moved once the truth was laid bare stood in stark contrast to the slow, agonizing unraveling of the mystery itself. Colonel Ainsworth, confronted with the irrefutable evidence and his wife's confession, offered no further resistance to Inspector Craddock's charges. Within days, the machinery of law had begun its inexorable work, transforming the peaceful drawing-room revelations into formal proceedings that would echo through the courts for months to come. Ainsworth, granted immunity in exchange for her testimony about her brother Arthur's central role in the conspiracy, provided details that filled the remaining gaps in the prosecution's case. Her evidence revealed how Arthur Whitmore had recruited accomplices through a combination of financial incentive and careful blackmail, creating a web of complicity that had seemed unbreakable until Eleanor's courage exposed it to daylight. The colonel received a sentence of life imprisonment, delivered by a judge who spoke with particular gravity about the betrayal of trust involved in murdering someone who had sought refuge in his home. Randall Field returned twice more from London during the following weeks, each visit bringing news of additional arrests and recovered artworks. The insurance investigation had expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations, revealing a network of fraudulent dealings that stretched across 3 counties. 17 people charged so far, he reported during his final visit to Miss Marple's cottage, accepting tea with the weary satisfaction of a man whose long investigation was finally bearing fruit, including 2 prominent auction house appraisers and a dealer who had been operating under false credentials for nearly a decade. Eleanor's evidence was more comprehensive than even we had hoped. Before departing Street, Mary Mead permanently, Field left a small leather-bound notebook with Miss Marple, a gesture of professional respect. "Lessons learned," he said simply, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had discovered that the most dangerous criminals often wore the most respectable faces. A letter arrived from the continent in a young, decisive hand. Nora Whitmore thanked Miss Marple for guarding the valor of another and enclosed a gift for the Church Restoration Fund. "We are all implicated by our silences," she wrote. "I am learning to answer questions I should have asked sooner." The letter carried the weight of someone who understood that courage, once witnessed, demanded a response from those who survived to remember it. The Cedars stood empty through the autumn months, its windows dark and its garden growing wild without the colonel's meticulous attention. Mrs. Ainsworth, broken by the revelation of her husband's crime and her own role in the conspiracy, departed for a cottage in Devon where her sister could provide the support she would need to rebuild some semblance of life. Eventually, a young couple from London purchased the property, drawn by its peaceful setting and unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The village itself recovered more slowly, the easy trust that had characterized their community replaced by a more cautious awareness of the complexities that could hide beneath familiar facades. Mrs. Bantry confided to Miss Marple that she found herself studying her neighbours with new attention, wondering what secrets might lurk behind their polite conversations and carefully maintained gardens. "It's made me quite suspicious," she admitted with characteristic honesty. "Fear makes us look for simple explanations, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "It's more comfortable to suspect the outsider than to acknowledge that evil can wear the most respectable faces. But suspicion without wisdom is merely another form of blindness." P.C. Troughton emerged from the experience with new gravitas, his methodical dedication having proved invaluable when others sought quick answers. Old Man Potter received quiet apologies and renewed respect for his simple honesty. The village's initial suspicion now recognized as the prejudice it had always been. The Renaissance locket, after serving as evidence in multiple trials, found its permanent home in the British Museum, where a small placard honored Eleanor's memory alongside the artifact she had died protecting. Visitors would admire its craftsmanship without knowing the full story of the young governess whose integrity had cost her everything, yet ultimately ensured that justice would prevail. As winter settled over Street Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving with meditative precision. She reflected on the patterns that connected human behavior across centuries and circumstances, how the desire for respectability could drive people to desperate acts when that respectability was threatened, how basting stitches left in place would always pucker the seam. The girl who never reached the station had completed her final journey, after all, arriving not at the destination she had planned, but at the place where truth and courage intersected with the eternal human struggle between expedience and principle. Eleanor's unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost, served as a reminder that individual choices, however small they might seem, could illuminate the darkness and ensure that justice, though sometimes delayed, would never be permanently denied. In the gentle rhythm of her knitting needles and the careful observation of human nature that had guided her through another complex case, Miss Marple found both satisfaction and profound sadness. The mystery had been solved, the guilty punished, and the innocent vindicated, but Eleanor's true legacy lay in the example she had set that some principles were worth defending even unto death, and that courage, once kindled, could light the way for others to follow toward truth and justice, no matter how high the cost or how long the journey. Spring returned to Street Mary Mead with the gentle persistence that characterized all natural cycles, bringing with it a sense of renewal that the village desperately needed. 6 months had passed since Colonel Ainsworth's conviction, and the daffodils pushing through the earth in Miss Marple's garden seemed to mirror the community's gradual emergence from the shadow of Eleanor Vance's tragedy. The Cedars had found new owners, a young couple from London with 2 small children, whose laughter now echoed through rooms that had once harbored such terrible secrets. They had planted a memorial garden where Eleanor's window had overlooked the grounds, filling it with herbs and white roses that would bloom each September in quiet remembrance. Miss Marple received regular correspondence that provided closure to the various threads of Eleanor's story. Randall Field wrote from London, with updates on the expanding investigation. 23 arrests now, with recovered artworks valued at over £200,000. "The entire network has crumbled," he reported with satisfaction. "Eleanor's evidence proved more comprehensive than we dared hope." A particularly touching letter arrived from Yorkshire, written in a hand remarkably similar to Eleanor's neat script. Her sister Margaret had established a scholarship fund for young governesses and teachers, ensuring that Eleanor's commitment to education and principle would continue helping others. She always believed that truth would prevail if good people were willing to seek it. Margaret wrote, "You proved her faith was justified." Nora Whitmore continued to write from the continent, her letters chronicling a journey from complicit silence to active advocacy for integrity in the art world. She had testified before parliamentary committees and worked with international authorities to strengthen authentication procedures, transforming her guilt into purposeful action. The Renaissance locket, after serving its role as evidence in multiple trials, found its permanent home in the British Museum. Miss Marple had visited once to see it displayed, noting the small placard that honored Eleanor's memory alongside the artifact she had died protecting. Visitors admired its craftsmanship without knowing the full price that had been paid to preserve it. Mrs. Bantry stopped by for tea on a particularly fine afternoon, bringing the comfortable companionship that had sustained their friendship through decades of shared observation. "The village has changed, hasn't it?" she mused, settling into her customary chair. "We're more cautious now, less trusting of appearances." "Perhaps that's not entirely unfortunate," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. "We learned that respectability can be the most effective disguise for evil, and that courage often wears the most ordinary faces. Eleanor taught us both lessons." The annual harvest festival, when it came again, carried a different quality, still joyful, but tempered with awareness. The villagers had learned to look beyond surfaces, to value substance over appearance. P.C. Troughton's methodical dedication was now recognized as the virtue it had always been, while Old Man Potter received the respect his simple honesty deserved. Dr. Haydock often joined Miss Marple for evening walks, their conversations touching on the complex patterns of human behavior they had witnessed. "Do you think Eleanor knew how much her courage would accomplish?" he asked one evening, as they paused near the church where she had hidden her precious evidence. "I believe Eleanor understood something her killers never grasped," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "That silence in the face of wrongdoing is not peace, but merely postponed reckoning. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and those who try to bury it often find themselves buried by it instead." As autumn returned with its reminder of cycles and seasons, Miss Marple reflected on the eternal patterns that connected human behavior across time and circumstance. Each case taught her something new about the complexities of human nature, yet fundamental truths remained constant: that evil often wore respectable masks, that courage could emerge from unexpected sources, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail if good people were willing to pursue it. The girl who never reached the station had indeed completed her final journey, arriving not at the London position she had planned, but at something far more significant: a place in the collective memory of all who valued truth over convenience and principle over safety. Eleanor Vance had died young, but her legacy lived on in the criminals brought to justice through her evidence, the scholarship bearing her name, and the example she had set for others facing similar choices between silence and truth. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in the gathering dusk as she offered a silent prayer for Eleanor's soul and quiet gratitude for the reminder that individual courage, however costly, could illuminate the darkness and guide others toward justice. The mystery was solved, the guilty punished, and the innocent vindicated. But Eleanor's true victory lay in proving that some principles were worth defending unto death, and that such courage, once witnessed, would never be forgotten by those wise enough to recognize its value.